Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review. I'm Liz Booker. We often hear reports of discrimination and harassment dismissed as isolated incidents and therefore not systemic problems with which to be dealt. I overheard a conversation the other day in which a gentleman discussing the possibility that even today, these incidents in aviation might not be isolated cases say, "We need data, not anecdotes." I would argue that we can look at the percentage of minority groups who experience these things all day long, and it will never have the power of the anecdotes, of the stories behind them. There's an emotional distance between us and the numbers, but when you live these experiences through the eyes of the victim, you gain a better understanding of their impact and meaning. And when those stories are put together, as they are in Becky Condon's She Flies and in Bev Weintraub's Wings of Gold, their power multiplies exponentially. And then when you combine the stories found in hundreds of books featuring women in aviation, you can no longer dismiss these anecdotes as isolated incidents. You cannot deny the power of their truth, neither the truth about disappointments, obstacles, or injustices, nor the truth of their inspiring victories and adventures. I'm honored to have as my guest today someone who took the time to amplify the anecdotes of the first 6 women to serve as naval aviators in her book, Wings of Gold, the story of the first women naval aviators. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and instrument-rated private pilot. As an editorial writer for the New York Daily News, she covered topics including education, social services, and aviation, and she shared the 2007 Pulitzer for editorial writing for an in-depth investigation into the illnesses afflicting World Trade Center rescue and recovery workers after 9/11. Her op-eds about women and aviation have appeared in the Washington Post. You can find her at her website, beverlyweintraub.com, on Instagram at Wings of Gold Book, Facebook at Beverly Weintraub Author, and on Twitter at Bev Weintraub. Bev Weintraub, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited and looking forward to this ever since we had a chance to talk when I facilitated a conversation with you on the panel at Women in Aviation International last year. So I've gotten to hear some of this before and in your other interviews, but I'm so excited for you to share it with me and with the book club and my audience. So I'm so happy to have you here. Can you give us an overview of your book, Wings of Gold?
Sure. So Wings of Gold tells the story of the first women to officially be brought into military flight training. It was an experiment by the Navy in the early 1970s. They recruited 6 women, 3 of whom were already officers or officer trainees, 3 of whom were civilians who signed on just for this program. And the idea was to just see what would happen if they put women in military flight training. There really wasn't much of a plan for what would happen to them if they got through the program, where they would be billeted, what would happen if they wanted a second billet, how women would be accommodated in what had been a completely all-male environment. And it goes through the challenges they faced, how they overcame them, how they didn't overcome them, what obstacles presented themselves to the kind of assistance they received, sometimes from very unexpected sources, and how they built their careers. And most of them did make careers in the military, despite the initial expectations of some of their squadron mates and the superior officers who didn't think they really belonged there. Some of them absolutely made history. They racked up an impressive array of firsts, and they were influenced by historical forces, and they changed history themselves.
Yep, they sure did. I can't wait to talk about these ladies and everything they accomplished. But before we do, you are a pilot yourself. Tell us about that.
So I am a private pilot, instrument rated, although I'm not current. That's a goal someday to get my currency back. I have my tailwheel, high performance, and complex endorsements. I am the proud owner of a Piper Archer II, which is so much fun to fly. I'm a member of the 99s, which is the International Organization of Women Pilots. I'm secretary of the Greater New York chapter, a former board member of the Air Race Classic, which is an annual 2,500-mile, 4-day, all-women's cross-country airplane race, which is a direct descendant of the original Women's Air Derby in 1929, which gave rise to the 99s. I've flown the ARC 5 times, and it's an absolute hoot. You see parts of the country you would never see otherwise. You test yourself, you learn so much, and you meet incredible people.
I can't wait to do it someday. But for now, I will continue volunteering. I think that's awesome. So how did you come to write this book?
Well, it kind of happened backwards. The story found me. I'm a journalist. I spent 24 years at the New York Daily News. Among other topics I covered was aviation. And one of my former Daily News colleagues works at the opinion section of the Washington Post. So occasionally when something happens in the news about women and aviation, I'll get an email, would you write something? So in 2019, Captain Rosemary Mariner, who was the most prominent of the 6 women in the book, passed away. And the Navy did the first all-woman missing man flyover at her funeral. Now, this made national headlines. I got an email from my friend at the Washington Post, would you write something? And I did. And then a couple of months later, I had an email from an editor at Lyons Press who had seen the column and thought it might make for an interesting book. What did I think? So the story absolutely found me. It was a little bit of a challenge finding the women, talking to them, figuring out, did they want to share their stories? And I was very fortunate that they did. 4 of them were still alive at the time I was researching the book, and they and their families were very willing to participate. Some of them had saved every last piece of paper, every last document, every last piece of memorabilia. They knew they had incredible stories, thought maybe they would write their own book someday, but it's a really hard thing to do. And then this stranger came along and said, I want to tell your life story. What do you think? And they said, okay. And it just blows me away that they trusted me to tell their stories.
Well, I'm so grateful that they did, especially if they hadn't had the chance to get to it themselves. I just can't think of anyone better to have written it. Wonderful. So tell us about them. Tell us about each of these 6 ladies. You just mentioned Captain Mariner, but tell us about the 6 that you kind of had.
The 2 officers were Judith Newfer-Bruner and Barbara Allen Rainey. Women at that time, if they weren't nurses in the Navy, they were either in administration or communications, and they were. Judy had grown up around airports. Her dad ran an airport. She soloed at 16 in his Piper Cub, but she never got her license. But when in 1972, what happened was that Admiral Elmo Zumwalt took over as the youngest chief of naval operations in history and discovered he was in the middle of a huge crisis. There was a huge personnel problem. The reenlistment rate was very, very low. And there were some forces at work that really made it seem like there was no easy solution to draw men who really didn't want to serve into what was going to become a all-volunteer military. Vietnam was winding down. Men had chosen to go to sea rather than fight in the jungle. That source of talent was going to dry up. It seemed that the Equal Rights Amendment was going to be approved and ratified, and all these restrictions that the Navy put on the women it did have would suddenly be unconstitutional. So Zumwalt needed to do something, and what he decided to do was open up many aspects of the Navy to women, and the flight training program opened up in the end of 1972. So we're approaching 50 years, 50th anniversary. And Judith Newfer-Bruner was the first to sign up. John Warner, who was the Secretary of the Navy, threw a huge press conference at the Pentagon and personally signed her training orders and brought in all the press and trotted out a huge set of wings. Barb signed on soon after. She had never flown before. She would actually become the first of the 6 to win her Wings of Gold. Judy would be the first woman to solo a Navy aircraft. She would become the first female Hurricane Hunter. And then she went on to work for NASA and did some incredible things there. The third, Jane Skiles O'Day, was in women's officer school, which was a thing back then. It was training women for administrative jobs. And there were rumors that flight training was going to open up. Her dad had been a naval aviator, and she had flown with him, but she didn't have her license. But she thought it sounded interesting. They weren't sure if it was going to happen, but she enlisted and figured, well, she could use the GI Bill to go to law school if it didn't pan out. It did. She was halfway through. She switched over to the aviation track. Was the first ensign to become part of the program. Now, the Navy had wanted 8 women. They could not find 8. They found 4 among officers or officers trainees. One of them dropped out. So then they told recruiters, go find us some civilians, which they did. They found 4. Another one dropped out of that group as well. The 3 civilians, Jo Ellen Drag-Osland, who was the first female helo pilot. She was basically a Navy brat, how she describes herself. Had never flown before. She was, I think, the only one of the 6 who had 0 aviation experience. She would discover that she was not allowed to fly with her squadron when she got to her first billet because of a technicality or a deliberate misreading of federal law that said women could not be in combat. The Navy interpreted that to mean that if this vessel could be in combat at some point, it had a combat mission, no women allowed. She couldn't do the job she was trained to do. She ended up party to a federal lawsuit that challenged those restrictions with some degree of success. Anna Maria Scott was the second of the civilians to sign up. She was the only one who did not come from a military background, but she had gotten her private pilot's license in college. Signed on. She, like a number of the women, they were recent college grads and they weren't really sure what they wanted to do. And this opportunity just came up and it seemed like an interesting thing to do and they went for it. And she went for it, became the second female helo pilot and ended up ferrying VIPs all over the place. And she has a great story about how she was sort of snuck aboard ships she wasn't supposed to be on because one of the lieutenants in her squadron thought the restrictions didn't make sense, and she was a helo pilot and she needed experience landing on ships, and he made sure that she got it, but she had to hide while she was doing it so nobody would know. Rosemary Bryant Mariner was the 6th to sign on. She was the youngest. She was the last one to sign up. She was a student at Purdue at the time, and she was the only one of the 6 who was clearly focused on aviation. She got her private when she was 17. She wanted flying lessons from the time she was 8 years old, and she, washed planes to pay for them and cleaned houses, that kind of thing. She tested out of a 1.5 years worth of school to make the program because the deadline was in the middle of her junior year, and she didn't. She could go to the Navy or she could stay at Purdue and graduate, and she just tested out of her classes and joined the Navy, and she would become the first woman to command an aviation squadron, the first woman to fly a tactical jet when women technically were not allowed to fly fighter jets, but she found a way to do it. And she and the other women, but she especially over the course of her 25-year career, opened doors for women and for men and really changed many, many aspects of the military that are still being felt today.
Amazing. All of them amazing. And especially the stories that you told about Rosemary and her impact overall. So you mentioned a little bit about how they've faced these obstacles and the law. Can you share a little bit about the strategies that they used to fight against them?
Well, there were a number of things that came as a bit of a surprise. The women were not allowed to select jets at the end of their flight training. The men with the best grades got to select jets. The lesser qualified men got propeller planes or helicopters. The women were limited to props and helos. They were not allowed to carrier qualify, which was the defining thing for a naval aviator is that you fly out to that aircraft carrier, land on it, you collect 10 traps or 10 landings, and you are a tail hooker. That is what made a naval aviator, and the women weren't allowed. They were not allowed to serve on ships. They were not allowed to do sea duty. Many limitations along the way. They were, in theory, not allowed to have children. It hadn't been long before that pregnancy was cause for automatic dismissal. So there were a number of early career roadblocks that they found ways over, around, under, through, some with help, some by banding together. There was one occasion where three of the women wrote a letter up the chain of command asking to be allowed carrier qualification. And the response was, well, not only are we not letting the women do it, but, we really don't think all the men need to do it anymore either, which was couched as a cost-cutting measure. But just in terms of coincidence, it seemed to the guys like the women had asked for something and now something was being taken away from them. So that really did not help their circumstances, and carrier qualification was not something that any of them could do for a little less than a decade. It took almost a decade. And by that time, these women were somewhat older. And, Jane talks about what it was like doing that cat shot when she was in, I don't know, her late 20s or so, early 30s. It's terrifying. When you're 21, 22 years old, you don't notice. When you're older, it really made an impression. Banding together and documenting everything, keeping paper trails, holding people to account, making sure that everybody up the chain and down the chain knows what you're doing, so your request can't just kind of be buried someplace. That was an effective tactic that was later modeled for Rosemary by her first CO, who was the first Black commanding officer at Naval Air Station Oceana. And he had a file folder with every African-American naval officer and where they were. And he spelled out for her, this is how the Black men who integrated the military, this is what they did to make sure that they were not cheated of what they deserved. And he modeled for her how they had done it and said, this is what the women need to do as well. And he mentored her in how to make that happen. The way she ended up flying jets was that he put her in for transition training. He had too many propeller pilots, not enough jet pilots. He took all his junior officers, put their names in, including hers. Her orders got lost. But then they got found, and it turned out that there was a former naval aviator who was making those assignments at the time, didn't know who she was. He thought it was ridiculous that, such a skilled pilot should not be allowed to fly jets, and he made sure she got the stamp of approval. She found out later who it was. Had no idea, and he didn't know her, but didn't seem right, and he fixed that. Jane O'Day, who became the first pregnant military pilot and the first military pilot mom, when she was assigned to a billet en route to Spain, and when she arrived, she was told, well, there's no bathroom. You're not allowed to use the bathroom. So there was a little bit of back.
Yeah, there's a difference between there's no bathroom and
right. There's no bathroom for you.
Yeah, and the one that we do have, you're not allowed to.
Right.
What's she supposed to do? Yeah. Squat out back?
Yeah. Well, what she said that there were actually two bathrooms, and one was labeled men and one was labeled officers. And she walked into the one labeled officers, and there were no stalls on the doors. And after that, they became men and women. You walk in on a bunch of officers doing their business, you get changes made. But when she got pregnant at that same billet, her skipper thought she was just going to go, and her husband and she and her flight surgeon decided, nope, she's staying. And she flew until her 7th month, basically by just refusing to leave, and set the precedent.
I'm grateful to her. Then there were lawsuits.
So for Joellen, when she realized she was not allowed to fly out to a ship, from San Diego, which is, the basic business. She sent request after request after request, and with her CO's backing, and they just disappeared. No response, nothing. And she and a couple of other officers started researching what else they could do. One of them was going to law school at night, and her constitutional law professor discovered that 4 enlisted women already had a class action suit in the works challenging some of these restrictions. The officers signed on to it, and Jo Ellen was named by name in the judge's ruling that found that the restrictions were unconstitutional. The underlying problem there was that it was federal law. Congress had made the law. Congress had to change it, which wouldn't happen, for another decade plus. But it did chip away at it, and it did open up some opportunities. The Navy changed some policies, I think probably more out of embarrassment of the bad publicity than anything else. But they did it. And Jo Ellen did get to serve on a ship.
In this talking about banding together, I was interested to learn the pieces about the Women Military Aviators Association. I mean, I was introduced to them at Women in Aviation International about 13 or 14 years ago for the first time, and went to their, they always do a flight suit social. And so I would go to those. I got to meet WASP there. I got to meet Night Witches there, which was incredible. And then the first time I put on a flight suit since I retired was this last year when I went to the flight suit social, and it felt weird to put it on, but when I got in the room, I felt right at home. But tell me talk a little bit about WMA.
Women Military Aviators, as you said, is an organization of, obviously, active duty, female military pilots, but also WASP, also family, also supporters, people who believe that women should have those opportunities and were, they were willing to fight for them. And in Congress in the early 90s, when the combat exclusion battle came to a head, it was WMA who had, along with some legal organizations and some other nonprofits, that organized and call it an education campaign, because women in uniform are not allowed to lobby Congress, but basically set up shop in a senator's office and conducted an education campaign explaining not only to the elected officials, but to their staffers, who are really the ones who do all the research and kind of recommend what their bosses ought to do, why this limitation on women in combat went far beyond what it seemed to mean, that it had absolutely no meaning in practical terms, and that Congress needed to fix this and change the law. And it was this huge battle that went on between WMA and their allies on one side, and some very, very well organized conservative organizations, female-led, on the other, looking to not only roll back the combat exclusion, but roll back the role of women in the military, period.
Yeah, I want to talk more about them, but I first want to give props to WMA, because I did not know that history. And, I've met a lot of these ladies, and I didn't know. You see them at this flight suit social, and you're like, oh, it's a drinking club, and we get to put our flight suits on. But it has a lot more meaning than that. And that scene in the book where you describe them in the halls of Congress, I was like, that is just awesome. I was so glad that they took that risk and did it, because I'm sure it was a risk for them. So yeah, let's talk about some of the opposition. First, James Webb's article. Wow. Just wow. I mean, I feel like that article must have been handed down over the next few decades to a few key people who I ran into in my career. Yeah. Just talk about the impact of that.
Right. So James Webb, who ran for president a number of years ago, or tried to, seeking the Democratic nomination, was the incoming Secretary of the Navy, and he was a Marine, had attended the Naval Academy. He was a Vietnam combat veteran, and had penned this lengthy opinion piece in Washingtonian magazine that was headlined, "Women Can't Fight." And it was a screed in opposition to opening the military service academies to women in the most blatant, sexist, offensive terms you can imagine. It baffles me that anybody would put that stuff in writing. But it was just stereotype after stereotype after assumption after, broad brush assumption. Talks about how the military is the only male bastion left and how damaging it will be if men are not allowed to have the benefits of being beaten with a bat, as he was by some upperclassmen, because it builds character, just the physical abuse he describes, and painting that as a good thing, and how women will just ruin it. It was absolutely horrendous. And it was devastating for the women in those initial classes, and for years after. It circulated among, these midshipmen, and this is where they would get ideas. There was one woman quoted in a newspaper story I saw at the time. It's like, they don't start at the Naval Academy thinking that. They learn it there. And that was how that perpetuated itself.
Yeah, it was horrible. I was mortified and shocked, just like you. I knew those attitudes were there and that they were said in smaller circles, but I could not believe that was put into print. I was just shocked. And then, of course, that condones that behavior and sets the tone for the culture for years and years and years. Well, it wasn't just him. We had our old gal, Phyllis Schlafly, and Elaine Donnelly. Talk about them, two of my faves.
Right. So Phyllis Schlafly, who was, I think, the better known of the two, I believe she was an attorney, an extremely talented political organizer, lived, I think, in Illinois, espoused traditional family values to the extreme, was instrumental in the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment, as opposed to the traditional family values of the woman in the home, taking care of the children, and the men working outside the home. And any change to that was threatening the foundations of society and could not be tolerated. Elaine Donnelly worked with her on many of these campaigns, was the head of her own organization, and they worked in tandem to defeat, this kind of progress in women's rights. And in the 70s, the women's movement was an extremely powerful societal force. They were on the other side trying to maintain the status quo. When the fight over the combat exclusion happened, they were very much on the other side from WMA, and they were putting out pamphlets and talking to politicians, explaining the evils not only of allowing women in combat, but allowing women in the military at all, because it's shameful that a man should have to be defended by a woman. Women don't have the strength. Women are too emotionally unstable. Those kinds of arguments. And one thing that kind of surprised me is that there was a hearing, a Senate hearing. The subcommittee went on for about 3 hours, and C-SPAN has it posted. You can go watch the whole thing if you want. It surprised me how the talking points from the senators who were trying to sound like they were neutral were actually echoing what Elaine Donnelly and Phyllis Schlafly were putting out. There was very much this push and pull.
Yeah, I think I wrote a paper. I was doing some community college classes when I was on active duty when I was 18, and I wrote a paper about this ERA and Phyllis Schlafly, and I was just shocked. I was shocked. I guess I grew up in a household with a mother who went through that movement and came out on sort of the WMA side, not as a military woman, as an academic, but still. So I was shocked to know that women Like, I kind of had a sense that there was a time when guys were trying to hold women back. But when I found out that these very public women were doing this, I was shocked at 18. And of course, I've known that for a long time. One of the things I really admired, because I think, and I'm not talking about Phyllis now, I'm talking about Rosemary Mariner. What I really admired about her was her willingness and her eloquence in presenting her point of view, and the willingness to do that very publicly, both while she was in the service and then after, because, not many people are willing to do that because they're trying to navigate within the system to succeed and to be vocal outside that system and expect to get what you want is not usually the right tactic. So I was very impressed throughout this story, just hearing her speeches, reading what she said. But I think my favorite is that passage on page 240. And you say that it is from, she was at the National War College and she had written a paper, but then she was giving a seminar and she editorialized some other things. Would you read that passage for me?
What you have with a lot of women is that the idea of equality is very frightening. What you are hiding behind is the myth of what we call the true woman, the whole idea that women have a higher, different moral reasoning than men. It goes back to this myth that women are somehow inherently different than men when it comes to issues of character or spirit. In order to maintain the presence that it's okay to want to be a coward and to hide behind your sex, you have to make all women like this, not just yourself. To me, that in a nutshell is the whole driving philosophy behind Phyllis Schlafly. The genesis of the anti-equal rights movement and the backlash to the equity feminism, as it's called now, goes back to the idea that I would be judged by the same standards, potentially as harshly as men, if I entered this world. So, for example, in Phyllis Schlafly's day, the epitome of being a woman was to marry well, be attractive, be smart, and all these other things, and have a family. She achieved that. Now, in order to gain the same recognition, she would have to go spend 8 years in medical school and be a brain surgeon. Maybe she wouldn't see her family every night. Maybe she would have to make some of those difficult choices that men have always had to make, the sacrifices in their personal lives and all the hard work that's involved to get the same recognition.
I was like, you go, Rosemary. I was shocked that she would say something like that. And I was cheering her on to hear it. What did you think about it?
It was very brave. I think it was well-deserved, but it was also, she wasn't throwing the first punch. There were conservative commentators, including Elaine Donnelly, including Phyllis Schlafly, and somebody named David Horowitz, who were lambasting Rosemary Mariner by name on TV and in print and calling her out and accusing her of motives that she never had, that no self-respecting woman would have. They were just like throwing the entire garbage can of accusations against the wall at her to try to discredit her and WMA in the fight against the combat exclusion. So she was fighting back. I mean, it was amazing. There's one CNN clip. It was a panel discussion debate show. And I was only at the beginning of my research into this. And I was watching the clip, and the first is a little discussion with Rosemary Mariner, and she's in uniform, and she's talking about her career a little bit and her aspirations a little bit. Does she want to be in combat now? And she says, no, that's ridiculous. I'm much too old. You know, she's not doing this for herself, for her own personal gain. And then they go to the panel and Elaine Donnelly is on. And I really didn't know who she was, but those two women, it was electric how much they despised each other. And it came through the screen. And I said, whoa, what is happening here?
Yeah.
I mean, it was visceral.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I'm not sure I would feel any differently. My word. Well, so what surprised you in your research?
What a couple of things surprised me. First, as we already talked about, how willing men are to put these ugly, insupportable sentiments out in public and to put them down in writing. I mean, who wants to memorialize that stuff? And how blind can you be? You see what's happening in society, and you say, well, I'm just going to take the opposite view in as offensive language as I possibly can. And I think that's okay, and everybody's going to think it's okay. It's nuts. I just couldn't understand how that happened. From a more personal side, I was surprised at how willing these women and their families were to let me into their lives and to share with me what they had done and their accomplishments and their fears, and just tell me their stories, open their homes, some of them, come to my house and see my archives. It was just amazing.
Were there any details or anecdotes that you wish that you could have put in the book but didn't fit, or anything that you couldn't get in there?
I wasn't looking to do necessarily, a full day-by-day accounting of anybody, because I was writing a history, not a biography, which, writing a biography of 6 people, I don't even know how you would do that. But what I was looking for was that, you had these 6 women who end up at this very special turning point in history and made it happen. So where were they? What were they doing? How did they react to what was going on around them? How did they affect change? And then getting their stories, sort of the 30,000 foot view of their stories, and then honing in on specific incidents that would illustrate these larger trends, right? So, and I was, fortunate, for better or for worse, that they all had stories that brought to life, the good and the bad of, what was happening to women in this time. There were some stories that, maybe it would have added some to the book, but it was a little bit of a delicate balance because, I was a stranger, I'm an intruder. I come in and ask people to participate in this project that maybe they didn't really want to. And, when you're getting near some personal issues, they're not asking me to ask them about this. I'm asking them questions maybe they don't want to talk about it. So it's a little bit of a dance, how much can I push? They're not, I'm not going after them. There's no reason
Right.
to. The idea was, this is going to be a celebration of these incredible accomplishments. And, what they accomplished was really, really amazing. So, whereas, there were some details that I would push for because I really thought they were important. If there were some things that clearly they did not want to talk about, that was okay. There are other ways to tell that stories. I had 6 people's life stories where I could look at what happened and decide which is the most evocative telling. Who really, personified this aspect of this piece of the history.
So what impact has writing this book had on you?
So it's really opened a world that I didn't know a whole lot about. I don't come from a military family. My father was in the New York National Guard. I had thought about, maybe I would fly for the military, when I was like 13, and my mom shut that down really fast. So, just the admiration I have for women who did not just decide, okay, I'll do something else. The first time they hit a hard no, the way I did, that was amazing. Reading the stories just blew me away. I always had respect for the military and particularly for military women, but wow, now it's like way, 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 the appreciation is just way beyond that. I've been struck by just, how humble they are. They did something incredible. It's over. They moved on with their lives. That's it. And, these echoes are still being felt. Some of these stories, they're still kind of come cycling back. And, they know what they did, but, that was then, and it's kind of over.
Well, so what impact do you hope it leaves on the readers?
I think it fills in a gap, or I hope it fills in a gap in U.S. history. Coincidentally, the new Top Gun movie came out a couple of months ago. And if you remember the first one, the big card at the beginning that explained what Top Gun is says only the best men get to go to Top Gun. Well, the new one, it says only the best men and women get to go to Top Gun. So you might think, oh, they just said, hey, we'll open the door to women. Come on. No, that's not what happened. They had to fight for it. And how that happened and who did it were lost. Those stories were lost. There's an interview with some of the flyover pilots that were done after Captain Mariner's funeral. And one of them said, they have these careers and they had no idea how that happened. They didn't know who had made that possible for them. And, these women were the ones who made that possible for them. So just in terms of, the overall historical narrative, I think that fills in a gap. The other thing that I'm hoping is that for younger women who are trying to forge careers and are maybe coming up against some of these same issues, because none of this stuff has gone away. It may take a different form, but none of this has vanished. To understand that people have gone through this before, women have come up against the same obstacles, have found ways around them, have persevered, have suffered the same pain and frustration and made it, is really inspiring, and hopefully, will give them the fortitude to fight their way to the careers they want.
Well, I 100% agree with you. First and foremost, they made my career possible for me. My Wings of Gold, wouldn't have had it without them. And now I have a completely new appreciation for exactly how and what they went through and how they overcame those obstacles. I sat in on the Women in Aviation International induction of Rosemary Mariner into the Hall of Fame last year. I knew it was important, but your book helped me understand deeply how and why it was so important. And now I feel connected to her as I do all these other women, even though I've met a couple of them. I just feel deeply grateful for them and their sacrifices, but also for your work, for bringing these stories to light.
You may not know, this was actually Captain Mariner's second WAI induction. They were inducted as a group in 2017.
I saw that in the book and I was like, well, wait a minute, then why did they do that again? But I guess it was because of the flyover.
Because it was because of the flyover and to honor her as an individual. One thing I found interesting was that, these 6 women are sort of talked about as a group. In many renderings are talked about as a class, and that's not accurate. They were never all in the same place at the same time. Maybe 1 or 2 of them served together for a little while. They were members of WMA, they networked, but they never were all together. So all these obstacles and challenges they had to overcome, and this was in the days before cell phones, before emails, before text messages, they were on their own in dealing with all this stuff.
I deeply appreciate that also. And we've come a long way, at least in that regard. We have resources at our fingertips that we didn't have when I was starting either. So yeah, it's incredible. Bev, this has been amazing. I know we can find you at your website, beverlyweintraub.com, and I put your social media contacts. I'll put them in the notes, and I set them in your introduction. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about before we move on, if you have the time to talk about writing?
Sure. Is there anything else I want to talk about? I think the lesson of these 6 women is just go for it. If there's something you want to do, even if somebody says no, well, maybe there's another way to go around it. If somebody says, no, you can't fly jets because jets are a combat mission, we'll fly a non-combat way to fly jets, which is what Rosemary Mariner did. She did develop kind of a parallel educational track for herself, doing the same skills with some of the same armaments, but she did it for research and development, not for combat. So, there may be another way around it, or you could be like Anna Maria Scott, who lands on a carrier, but she's not allowed to get out of the helicopter and she has to keep her visor on, so nobody will know.
That girl got lucky they didn't have a maintenance issue and get stuck on that boat. Trust me. I heard that and I was like, oh, that's risky. Well, Bev, this has been amazing. I appreciate it. And if you have the time, I'd love to talk to you about writing, but thank you so much for the time to talk about this book and for your incredible support and participation in the book club and in the writers group. You've been a wonderful mentor for us, and we're so grateful to have you.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thanks so much for listening. I'd like to thank Shasta Ways and Michael Wilds of the Women's SOAR Group for their assistance in producing this interview. The Women's SOAR Group is a media company that gives women a platform to express themselves. Don't forget to check the show notes for a link to sign up for the Literary Aviatrix monthly newsletter. Blue skies and happy reading.